Good morning, everybody. So, we have now already outlined the content we want to include in our curriculum. And obviously, in your content, very likely there are sections and subsections in your course outline or a content outline. So what happens is that just writing the content outline does not complete the curriculum, because one of the purposes of the curriculum, and the major one, is we are trying to articulate what are the learning outcomes we want our students to gain or achieve once they complete a grade or a unit. So in our case, it's a unit curriculum. Therefore, once the students finish this unit curriculum, meaning once the teachers complete the unit curriculum, what students should have learned. So in the curriculum, we want to articulate intended learning outcomes. And so intended learning outcomes are important because they allow us to figure out what are some of the issues or important aspects of the curriculum we need to articulate and figure out as our curriculum design progresses. So for example, when we write teaching strategies in the curriculum, in our curriculum, then based on the intended learning outcomes, we can decide what kind of teaching strategies will be appropriate for which components of the curriculum. So that is an important aspect of it. One of the things about the intended learning outcome is that it does three major things. One is intended learning outcomes, or ILOs. They guide instruction and instructional planning. So they allow the teachers, once they look at the curriculum, they allow the teachers to plan their instruction and how they should proceed. The second part of it is that it communicates to the students and the public what they will be learning and how the resources are being used, or what are some of the things students will do in the class. And the last thing is that the intended learning outcome, what it does is that it allows us to see what are different indicators or evidence of success that we could glean just by intended learning outcome. So for example, if one of the intended learning outcome in a unit curriculum is that students will understand the nature of interaction between force and motion. So reading that statement allows us to figure out, or the teachers to figure out, what kind of evidence they will need to show that the students understood that. Or if the intended learning outcome in a course, let's say a biology course, is that students will understand why plant cells have cell walls, then the evidence for that understanding, for that learning outcome to be assessed or to be shown by the students, now the teachers can figure out whether the teacher wants them to show it in a lab setting, or the teacher wants them to show it in a quiz or any other format. So that's very important in terms of the learning outcomes. So there are three things about the intended learning outcomes that we think about when we write it in our curriculum. One is it tells us how to instruct, or our pedagogy. Two, it is a communication tool between the curriculum and the teacher or the public or the students. And finally, it allows us to decide what kind of assessment tool will be the most effective in assessing what the students learned, because learning outcomes we want to know about. The other, in terms of the instruction and instructional planning, is that whenever we write intended learning outcomes for that is really good, is that it should clearly specify the kind of learning outcomes involved so that appropriate instructional strategies can be designed to accomplish that. And we'll go back to that later too when we talk about teaching strategies. So for example, if we want students, if an intended learning outcome is about giving students experience of researching, then we have to design a instruction where students can research on a certain topic. Similarly, in terms of the communication, is that we need to write our intended learning outcomes in an unambiguous manner. But it's really hard sometimes to write an intended learning outcome in a very unambiguous manner. Obviously, in terms of the other part of it, is that intended learning outcomes also allows teachers to plan appropriately in terms of, for example, what kind of behavioral indicators do I need in my classroom in order to show a certain learning outcome has been achieved. So that's a very important thing. One of the things that I need to mention here, and it's on in page 86 and 87. On page 87, chapter 4, there's a nice little schematic that shows the difference between behavioral objectives and intended learning outcomes. Intended learning outcomes can be both behavioral and non-behavioral, meaning observable and non-observable. For example, students understand the nature of gravitational force is an unobservable learning outcome, whereas students will solve a problem using Newton's laws is a behavioral objective. So just keep in mind that intended learning outcomes can be both behavioral objective, but they necessarily don't have to be behavioral objectives. The other part of the intended learning outcome is that you can write intended learning outcome based on what kinds of learning you would want to focus on. So for example, you can write behavioral objectives where the affective aspect of students are also measured or valued. So for example, if we say that we want our students to realize that scientific endeavors are filled with uncertainties, that's an important intended learning outcomes. So that could be taken as affect. Similarly, the intended learning outcomes could be written for cognitive skill development in terms of what are different ways we can find out what students know, and that generally we do that by quizzes, many different ways we find out what students have learned in a content which falls under cognitive. And then obviously we can have a psychomotor intended learning outcome, which is basically performing. So for example, if you want to if a curriculum is important that we measure students' ability to use let's say a vernier caliper, then it can be an intended learning outcome, as students will know how to use a vernier caliper. That will be a psychomotor. So when you write intended learning outcomes, you want to ensure that these outcomes are important. So you don't have to write intended learning outcomes for everything. You also want to make sure that the intended learning outcomes are written from the highest priority, the most important first, and the least important later. So that way you can take out some of the least important ones if you need to. Generally, for the purposes of this class, I encourage you to write between 2 to 8 intended learning outcomes for a particular content idea. So for example, let's say if you are teaching students on let's say forces and motion, so in that case, so for example, if you want to talk about speed, velocity, so you may want to think about, do you want to also talk about average speed? Then you will need intended learning outcomes for average speed also. So for example, if you are talking about cells and cell division, then are you also talking about the structure of animal cells? You need intended learning outcomes for structure of animal cells. And then if you are also talking about different parts of the animal cells, then you want to have intended learning outcomes that represents different parts of the animal cells. Just 2 to 8 for each of the content ideas or concepts that you have, and you can write it either as a behavioral objective, the way you write in your lesson plan, or you can write it as unobservable objective. It doesn't matter which way you write it, but try to include both the cognitive, affective, and psychomotor and perceptual skills in it. But obviously the most number of intended learning outcomes that you will write will be on cognitive skills, means how much content they have learned. And so this will now set up for you to be able to thinking about, once you write your intended learning outcomes, then you can think about what would be your teaching strategies, or how would I assess these things. So I hope this makes sense, what is a intended learning outcome, and I will be ready to take any questions or on anything to clarify about intended learning outcomes. And I hope you will have a wonderful day. Talk to you soon.